Hey there, 8th graders. Time for another ISN update, this time for the School of Rocks. We're going to start with, I suppose, Big Idea A, and start with question A1, which really is kind of a quick one. How do we divide up the history of the Earth, and how many chunks do we create? So if I were to start up the Prezi here, we of course have this notion of deep time. 4,500,000,000 years worth of Earth history is a lot, and so the nickname deep time kind of sticks. What we actually do is we break up time into large chunks called eons. Smaller chunks within an eon can be divided down into eras. You could take an era and divide that down into smaller chunks of time called geologic periods, and you can take one geologic period and break it down into smaller chunks of time called epochs or epochs. I don't know, tomato, tomato. Another way to look at it, other than the eye chart variety, is kind of like this. And you have an eon. Within an eon, you have eras. Within an era, you have geologic periods. Within geologic periods, you have epochs. And actually, there are a lot more subdivisions of time and history. But those are some of the basic ones. And so for you to be familiar with the different geologic eras, there are four main ones. You have the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. The Precambrian, kind of a weird name, but it's a huge chunk of time. If you remember from your geocalendar, it takes up almost the entire calendar itself. It's about 4 billion years worth of the 4.5 billion years worth of history. So there's a lot of history there. The Paleozoic, paleo means ancient and zoic means animal, so Paleozoic is ancient animal. The third era is the Mesozoic, and that meso means middle. This would be the time of the dinosaurs, and then finally you have the Cenozoic, which is recent animal. Those are the different geologic eras. Now, if we were to go through the different major events in geologic history, there's so many of them, too many of them really, to go through all of them. But we'll do our best to go through at least a few of them. So we're going to go through geologic history here in fairly rapid order. So you'll have to excuse the sound that we're about to get here. I think that's my stomach, I'm not sure. So if we start off in the Precambrian of course begins with the solar system forming from a nebula that we learned way back in star stuff, the nebular theory. Smaller clumps of gas condensing would have formed the planets, and even smaller ones would have formed moons. So initially the Earth was quite hot. And as it cooled down, it took something like 500 million years, we believe, for the Earth's surface just simply to cool down to the point where it could become solid rock as opposed to magma. And so, yeah, 500 million years, it's a bit of a long wait here. So patiently, though, the Earth begins to cool, the rocks become solid, and finally you have a planet with a solid crust. What's really remarkable is it doesn't take very long for the first primitive bacteria to show up in the fossil records. That happens fairly early on in the geocalendar. I believe it happens within February, the end of February. And of course, the Earth's crust didn't cool until February 10th on our geocalendar. So not all that much time transpires before you get liquid water and you get critters, at least bacteria, fossilized. But these bacteria were very primitive, not nearly as sophisticated as most bacteria and other types of single-celled organisms that we find alive today. In fact, we think they were autotrophs, chemotrophs to really begin with. Autotrophs show up partway through the Precambrian, and autotrophs can photosynthesize, they can build up oxygen basically into our atmosphere by taking in carbon dioxide, photosynthesizing, and releasing oxygen. In fact, it's the autotrophs that really led to the quote-unquote contamination of our atmosphere with toxic gases. It's known as the Great Oxygen Catastrophe. It was great for us. It was a catastrophe for some of the earliest bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria, because they die in the presence of oxygen. But it was these autotrophs that really kind of helped to create the oxygen atmosphere that we have today. With oxygen, you get all sorts of cool things. Like, for example, you can form ozone in the upper atmosphere, which is really just 3 oxygen atoms together. And ozone's important because it protects the surface from ultraviolet radiation. So life on the solid ground, on land, would be impossible without ozone. So the Great Oxygen Catastrophe was important. And we all know what ultraviolet exposure can do to life forms. It can turn them into terribly, horribly mutated things, such as what you see in front of you on the screen. ultraviolet. Stay away from it. All right. Also during the Precambrian, we have, shortly after the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, we have the Earth's oceans freezing over. There's evidence that would suggest that we had glaciers even at the equator at that point. And so the whole planet nearly froze over. It was a catastrophe, really, of sorts. Shortly after that, there's evidence that the oceans warmed up again. We do start to see the first cooperation between cells where they work together, organize into colonies, the first multicellular critters. Everything changed after that, of course. With multicellular life, things like you and I are possible. Of course, in the Precambrian, we also have iron deposits forming in Minnesota. The Iron Range, as it's known, was deposited during this time, and in part because of all that oxygen in the atmosphere, the iron was able to oxidize and rust and form into these deposits right here. So a little bit of Minnesota history. Also some more Minnesota history. The Pinocchian Mountains are formed. This would be, of course, the St. Cloud granites, and they came during the Precambrian as well, approximately about 2 billion years old, if I remember the date correctly. Those ancient mountains have come and gone. They've been eroded. Also during this time, there was a giant rift or tear down the middle of the continent, and there's evidence that it ran right through Minnesota. What caused it to shut down and stop tearing apart, we're not sure. But certainly very intriguing that for a time it looked like the continent was going to separate right there. And that'll tie in later with plate tectonics and continental drift when you start learning about that. Also, after that time, there's evidence of another huge mountain range. The Transcontinental Arch ran through Minnesota, Kansas, and parts of the West. That mountain range has also now been eroded down to nothing. The only thing left is little bits of Sioux quartzite sitting up on the surface. We also start to see true multicellular organisms towards the end of the Precambrian, really weird looking creatures whose fossils we have a difficult time trying to figure out because some of them are so bizarre. And then the Precambrian ends and leads us into the Paleozoic. The Paleozoic begins with this explosion of diversity, lots of different new kinds of animals, all with hard outer shells. It's an exciting time if you're a geologist looking and studying life, because all sorts of new and crazy kinds of creatures show up. All invertebrates at this point. We don't find any kind of vertebrate animals with a backbone or an organized central nervous system, but lots of invertebrates. And with the shells comes defense and all sorts of added adaptations. So life was very different back then during the early Paleozoic. The oceans, you can see where Minnesota is right here. The gray area is where it was flooded with water. The lighter colored area is where there's dry land. This is the equator. And yeah, Minnesota was right on the equator at one point, partially covered by the ocean during the early Paleozoic. Then a little bit later in the Paleozoic, there's evidence that the entire state was underwater. We also have sediments deposited during the Silurian time period of the Paleozoic. It appears as if things dried out during the Devonian time period, but then we were resubmerged during the Mississippian, and that those deposits of sediments were left behind. Then during the Pennsylvanian, we dry out again, and during the Permian, the last period of the Paleozoic, we're fairly dry, and we're still hovering around the equator. Lots of crazy things happening in the Paleozoic. In terms of life, we get the first fish, fossilized fish. We get the first fossilized plants, true land plants, things like evergreens, those types of plants. We also see the first insects on dry land, fossils of insects, large things like Arthropleura, which is a 6-foot-long centipede, essentially. We find lots of other cool things, too. Dragonflies as large as eagles and spiders as large as an adult person's head. We also find amphibians after that in the Paleozoic. After amphibians, we can start to see fossils of reptiles. And we even find this really curious kind of animal, which we've nicknamed proto-mammals. And those animals tended to have features that looked kind of reptilian, but also kind of mammalian. So hence the name proto-mammals. The most famous proto-mammal, at least in terms of kiddie toys here, would be the Dimetrodon. If you ever had any dinosaur toys with this creature that looked like it had a big fin on its back, that's actually a proto-mammal. It's a Dimetrodon, which lived during the Paleozoic. But the Paleozoic came to an end when 95% of all of the species became extinct at that point. So we decided to cut off that period and start a new geologic period. The new period is known as the Mesozoic. Proto-mammals made it through into the Mesozoic. And those proto-mammals we highly suspect led, of course, onto regular mammals and also perhaps dinosaurs. But during this time, mammals stayed small, dinosaurs dominated during the Mesozoic. The same kind of story where the seas roll in and the seas roll out. It's dry during the Triassic time period and the Jurassic time period, but in Minnesota during the Cretaceous, the third and final period of the Mesozoic, we're actually covered on the west by another ocean. Shark's teeth are located in western Minnesota, turtle bones, fish vertebrae, lots of cool marine type animals. Dinosaurs become dominant, of course, throughout the Mesozoic. They're really the success story. They managed to keep mammals down during that whole time and led to a huge diversity of different kinds of critters, both plant eaters and meat eaters. All the stereotypical dinosaurs you think of, Triceratops and T-Rex, Parasaurolophus, Velociraptor, they're all there. Of course, some other cool things are going on during the Mesozoic. The first true flowering plants appear during the middle of the Mesozoic. Grass would be included with that. Some of the earliest birds we find, which look distinctly like dinosaurs, and so we think there's a strong connection between dinosaurs and birds. And of course, during the Mesozoic, good things come to an end here. This mass extinction that we find at the end of the Mesozoic wiped out 75% of all species. Dinosaurs were just among that 75%, but it impacted all life forms all across all of the different kingdoms. What survived then after the end of the Mesozoic? Well, mammals made it through, and birds made it through, and a fair number of other animals. So life thrives again after the Mesozoic mass extinction. During the Cenozoic, dry at last, fairly recognizable landform here of North America. We get lots of cool mammals, though. Really now it's the time of the mammals, and so we find lots of fossils of crazy-looking things, titanotheres, glyptodonts, and all sorts of crazy kind of critters, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and they're all there. And very cool. Most of them are extinct now, of course. We're only familiar with the mammals that are still around. One crazy thing, there were terror birds at one point, birds that were about 8 to 10 feet tall that we think hunted the ancestors of horses, which at that point were small animals, maybe about 2 to 3 feet tall. So there was a time when birds hunted horses, as crazy as that is. And of course, the amazing thing is that humans are found in the Cenozoic, but not until the last 4 million years worth of rocks. And so humans are probably some of the youngest species on the earth, which is really surprising. That's something we did not expect to find. So it just goes to show the human adventure is just beginning. We have a lot of history yet to write as a species if we're wise enough and smart enough to take care of ourselves and take care of the planet that we're on. So that's geologic history right there. With 2 minutes left, I think I'm going to pause it here. On the next video cast, we'll go over question A3. This is A1 and A2 for you right there. So best of luck to you. Bye.